Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, we're going to take a look at the interesting developments going on in Pakistan, where Balochi activist leader Mir Yar Baloch has declared the Sovereign Democratic Republic of Balochistan. So we'll examine again its structural parallels to the Khalistan movement and also examine those complex dynamics that also involve the larger powers in the region, China and of course Pakistan and India, and how they all interact. But also, this is an interesting one, we're going to go back 2 centuries and take a look at the battle standards, that is the flags, the battle flags of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sarkai Khalsa, the great Sikh empire, and how their fascinating symbology proves to a sceptical India today how historic Khalsa statehood, back from the Sikh empire days, offers a much more egalitarian blueprint over what modern India could ever achieve under Hindutva. All in the flags. It's fascinating stuff. Anyway, we also then turn to Western capitals. And of course, from good old stalled trade deals in New Zealand, interestingly, to Canadian diplomatic purges, we're going to analyse the Five Eyes law enforcement dilemma, knowing India's human rights abuses, yet bound by profit-driven globalist trade. And finally, retired bureaucrat KBS Sidhu has called for a truth commission in Punjab. Will it happen? And really, to wrap up, I've got some fantastic video footage. The future is all really about the young, and young Sikh students are showing where their hearts and loyalties lie. And I've got some really good graduation videos to show you, so do stay tuned for the towards the end of the show for those. And of course, at the end of the show, I will be looking at loads of great comments which have been filling up beneath the video. So thank you guys so much for all your comments. Right, a lot to get through, as always. I do say that on most shows, don't I? Because most shows I seem to cram as much in as I can. Well, indeed, it's this is a fascinating story, actually. We've talked about it periodically as sort of things have developed over the last sort of year or two. But certainly, 10 days ago, 11 days ago, a formal declaration of independence was published by Baloch activist leader Mir Yar Baloch. And it went viral across global media networks, and it sparked intense international debate over really the whole future of South Asia's longest running separatist conflict. And writing on behalf of this proposed Democratic Republic of Balochistan, Mir Yar Baloch issued a formal open appeal to the United Nations and sovereign governments worldwide, urging immediate international diplomatic recognition for a newly sovereign Baloch state. That's fascinating stuff, this. And the claim is set out in a public letter, and it's quite staggering, I have to say, in its whole sort of operational scope. I mean, you cannot but not take this seriously. He's made all sorts of claims, particularly over territorial control, and this statement basically asserts that indigenous Baloch resistance forces, and they're spearheaded by the Baloch Liberation Army, the BLA, and allied forces, the allied regional fronts, he claims are now effectively commanding and controlling and administering nearly 85% of Balochistan's geographical territory. And this declaration also announces the formal adoption of national symbols, including a national flag, a national anthem. The national anthem is entitled Ma Chukain Balokani. And I'll play it for you, but you know my technical issue, I can't play the noise for any noise for you for some bizarre reason. But anyway, it's very nice, but I would call it an acquired taste. And also the introduction of an independent national currency. So he's even proposing their own currency. They call it the Balochi phallus. And the letter also claims full operational control over the region's huge natural wealth, which does include natural resources, including gold, copper deposits, very large ones actually, over 1,200 coal mines and more than 150 active natural gas fields. So again, if you know they could genuinely secure their borders as a sovereign nation, they are not without resources, a lot of natural resources. And crucially, he alleges that nearly 500,000 personnel, comprising civil administrators, alongside Pashtun and Baloch soldiers that are serving currently with Pakistan's armed forces and police and frontier corps, they've all apparently resigned their posts to join the defence forces of the new republic. So again, it's a huge claim. very hard, obviously, to corroborate these sorts of claims. I mean, social media is obviously just spreading out this, but in terms of getting alternative corroboration of his claims, it's extremely hard. So it's very hard to know really what the truth is. So anyway, just so you can sort of visualise where we are talking about, of course, it is that really strategic location bordering both Iran and Afghanistan on the west. And then, of course, it's got that hugely important, strategically important Arabian Sea frontage as well. And then abuts Karachi. So all this aside, and it does make quite an exciting story in and of itself. And of course, it does mirror a lot of the Khalistan story, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But ultimately, of course, we do have to try and corroborate a lot of really what's going on and just apply a bit of objectivity to this. And of course, these are sweeping claims of total territorial control and administrative control. But it has not been independently verified by any international observers, at least that I can see. And Islamabad itself has actually remained silent, which is understandable, because they obviously don't want to sort of feed into this sort of propaganda machine of the Balochi sovereign state. But Islamabad has also maintained some pretty heavy counterinsurgency operations across the province. I've got some video actually of that, which I'll show you in a moment. It was an operation called Operation Shaban. But whether or not this Republic of Balochistan currently does function as a fully realised legal state under international law, what really matters is the viral impact of this declaration, and it really reflects an undeniable truth. The post-colonial framework of this whole area, in other words, since the British pulled out of this whole area, what's left all these years later is a whole region that is under severe structural strain. And again, we often talk about the balkanisation of India, but we rarely really talk about the potential balkanisation of old India, as in Pakistan, before it became Pakistan. And Balochistan is a symptom of that structural strain. These cracks are well, I would say appearing. They've actually always been there, but they are really starting to widen now. Now, to understand, of course, why this Balochistan independence movement matters so much to us, of course, you've got to look beyond the immediate headlines from Quetta in Balochistan and Islamabad up north, and take a look at the deeper structural mechanics that are going on here. Now, there's an awful lot of propaganda sort of pieces out there, a lot of AI-generated sort of pictures. But ultimately, if you study the grievances that are being articulated by this guy, Mir Yarbalik, you start to realise that the anti-colonial struggle that this guy is fighting and his forces are fighting, particularly against the Pakistani federal state, does share direct and fundamental parallels with our struggle, the Sikh struggle for Khalistan against New Delhi. Both movements, of course, represent nations caught in this trap of post-colonial state centralisation. So again, the parallels are very clear. And if we just take a look at one or two of them just in more detail, if we have a look at, for example, the economic exploitation and the resource exploitation that mirror between the Khalistan argument and the Balochistan argument. Balochistan is geographically Pakistan's largest province, as you saw in the map. But it does, as I've mentioned before, contain huge amounts of gold, copper, natural gas, the hydrocarbons, that power the industrial centres of Punjab and Sindh provinces, the other two provinces in Pakistan. But despite generating all this huge amounts of wealth for that federal centre in Islamabad, Balochistan remains the poorest, most underdeveloped region in the country. And it is marked by extreme poverty and, of course, just a huge lack of basic infrastructure. The investment has not come from central Delhi, central Islamabad, but that's the mirror, you see. In other words, the local population in Balochistan are seeing their own ancestral lands being exploited, but getting none of the economic returns for it. In other words, it's all just pouring back into Islamabad. Now, of course, then the parallels to Punjab are obvious, and for decades, Punjab, I'm talking about India, Punjab now, Punjab has served as the agriculture engine of the Indian subcontinent, feeding millions through its huge wheat and rice yields. But of course, New Delhi has systematically diverted Punjab's life-giving river waters, amongst other things, its agriculture, all its natural resources, without any real compensation. It's stripped Punjab of its industrial base. It's left its whole agricultural economy burdened with unimaginable debt. And of course, that's even before we start talking about the pollution, the environmental degradation, the environmental catastrophe. So you can see in both cases between Balochistan and Khalistan, central imperial capitals treat these rich peripheral homelands not as any sort of equal partners, but of course as just resource colonies to exploit and harvest. So again, the parallels are very obvious. And then we come on to state repression and, interestingly, enforced disappearances. Now, I will play you now in the background this video that I talked about. This is Operation Shaban. This is actually an operation that was launched by the Pakistan forces to try and quell the Balochi, I was going to call it insurgency. Is that the right word? Yeah, I suppose you could argue it is an insurgency. But it is a resistance movement. Anyway, this is the Pakistan forces fighting against this resistance movement. Now, this, of course, does reveal this second parallel, and it is the mechanics of state control. And for decades, the Pakistani military apparatus has relied on extrajudicial killings like Punjab in India. It's relied on arbitrary detentions, thousands of enforced disappearances to silence Balochi political dissidents and activists and journalists. So again, this is all familiar stuff, isn't it? And this exact blueprint of state terror was, of course, deployed against Punjab during the 1980s and 1990s, the subject of discussions that have been ever since the Satluj film was released a couple of weeks ago. And likewise, it was, certainly in Punjab, it was marked by those mass illegal secret cremations, the custodial deaths, the extrajudicial executions, which, of course, by Jaswant Singh Kalra documented. And even today, that legacy of state overreach continues through very similar methodology. Also, the lawfare, draconian acts like the National Security Act, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, they're all used to arbitrarily detain political figures. Of course, people like Amritpal Singh and others, without trial. So again, the legal and the enforcement methodologies really are parallel. And then we talk about foreign interference and I suppose what you call civilizational resistance. Now, analytical observers of self-determination movements like these do say, look, you've got to apply quite a critical lens on these sorts of things. You've got to just be a little bit circumspect, is the word. In other words, just it is all very romantic. It's very emotional. It is, it always makes a great story. This sort of establishment of a new nation. But of course, the parallels between Balochistan and Khalistan don't always align. And this is why, and I've said this before. I've done pieces before, sort of similar to this, saying, look, don't get too carried away with the Balochi struggle, because the structural parallels between the two sovereign fights are undeniable, but the broader geopolitical realities are actually very, I wouldn't quite say different, but they are very complex and they are deeply hazardous if you try and sort of apply the same principles to both. And Balochistan, where it sits geographically, is really at the epicenter of a very dangerous tri-state superpower battle that involves Islamabad, Pakistan, New Delhi, India, and Beijing, China. So it's caught geographically within those three powers. I was going to say superpowers, but India and Pakistan, growing superpowers anyway. Now, China, for example. China has a huge impact on Balochistan because they've got this multi-billion-dollar China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC. And that's all tied into the deep water port at Gwadar. Beijing has effectively colonised Balochistan to secure its own global trade routes. It is that corridor down from China down to the Arabian Sea. Let me just actually flash back to the map there so you can see it. So basically from the north up here, this corridor goes down to the coast here that China has essentially created for itself in alliance with Pakistan because it wants access to the Arabian Sea and therefore the world, but for military reasons and for commercial reasons. So ultimately, as I say, Beijing has effectively colonised the area for its own global trade routes. So as a result, Balochi insurgents aren't just fighting Islamabad, they're up against China, which is drawing Beijing deeper into this South Asian counterinsurgency discussion. So again, you can't talk about Balochistan without involving China. Khalistan, on the other hand, is less affected by this because it is not involved in this trade corridor. Which is interesting because it does recall back to a video that I think I talked about, must be 2 or 3 weeks ago, where there was an accusation by Hindutva that the Khalistan movement was funded by China, which is an interesting angle on it. It's nonsense, it's not. But again, you start to see the complexities, why this is not a simple black and white discussion. It's not just a simple fight for sovereignty, it's a lot more than that. And then we've got the intelligence war, the proxy war through all the intelligence agencies. And India's long been accused by Pakistan of covertly funding and arming Balochi separatists. Because, of course, it is a strategic counterweight against Pakistan, because Balochistan is a convenient mischief maker for the Pakistan government. So, of course, India's going to support it. But just as Islamabad has actually arguably weaponised proxy networks against India. And again, hence the accusations from Hindutva that Pakistan, ISI, are funding the Khalistan movement, which again is not true, but they do align in terms of their interests. So again, you've got this proxy war of India and Pakistan, these sort of age-old enemies, are accusing each other of funding these insurgency movements, these sovereignty movements of Khalistan and Balochistan. So again, the complexities start to surface. And it does expose really the ultimate warning for any liberation movement, including, of course, the Khalistan movement. When a nation's legitimate fight for human rights and civil liberties and sovereignty starts then becoming entangled with all these intelligence rivalries of the bigger regional superpowers, it really does create problems. There is a constant risk of just being reduced to a disposable pawn on that regional chessboard. And on that point, 1947, watch my podcast tomorrow with Dr. Graywell, because we talk about that exact discussion in relation to the Khalistan movement, but also the Sikh people, how they lost out in 1947 during partition. It is exactly that same argument. So do watch the podcast tomorrow. That discussion was at the end of the podcast, where basically we have this point saying, look, in 1947, Sikhs lost out because of various reasons, but not least because they were essentially a useful small pawn being argued between the Hindus and the Muslims. Anyway, that's beside the point. So ultimately, true sovereignty can't be just borrowed from intelligence agencies of neighbouring states or whatever. It's got to be grounded in much firmer foundations. It's got to be grounded in moral authority, grassroots legitimacy, democracy, and unyielding self-reliance. It's got to be able to stand up on its own, which of course are all the boxes that are ticked by Khalistan. So ultimately, yeah, keep an eye on Balochistan. We will do, because it's an unfolding situation. Who knows where this is going to lead? Because this whole region, as I say, it's so volatile. And as I said in the early stages of this story, this post-colonial era is really, it is entering a new era. I think it's a new epoch of this post-colonial time of the whole subcontinent, where we are seeing these fractures growing and growing between all these various areas. And as we discuss in the podcast tomorrow, which you'll see, Dr. Graywell, my regular guest, is absolutely convinced, as indeed am I have to say, that India is facing balkanisation, and arguably Pakistan may go with it. So there could be a complete rearrangement of this whole region suddenly. It's fascinating stuff, I have to say. Right, this is an interesting story. It's interesting to me. I don't know about you guys, but I was on social media the other day and I saw a fascinating post that somebody put up. And the post said, "This is the battle flag of Maharaja Ranjit Singh." I thought, wow, that is fantastic. What a fascinating thing. This is the real flag. It's not, also it's not just a picture, obviously it is a picture, but this is a picture of the real flag. It's not created, it's not drawn, it's not AI. This is the original, or one of the original flags that flew in the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So it prompted me just to do a little bit more digging, because it's always fascinating, and flags are so symbolic of so many things. Of course, people die under flags. They fight and die. They spill their blood. They give the ultimate sacrifice for flags. That is how important they are, because of course they are symbolic. It is what they represent. And likewise, it is what is on those flags that makes them so deeply symbolically important. So I want to go back 2 centuries to Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Sikh Empire, the Sarkar-i-Khalsa. And of course, it was an amazing time, a fascinating time. We do obviously talk about it a lot because it has so much impact on today's Khalistan discussions. Now, in recent years, there's been an incredible array of military banners and battle standards that were captured by those original British forces during the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars of the 19th century, the sort of the 1840s, 1850s. And they've all been preserved and displayed in all sorts of different museum collections across Europe and North America, whether it's Lichfield Cathedral here in England to the Asian Art Museum over on the West Coast in San Francisco. And of course, to the casual observer, or those accustomed actually, in fact, to modern ethno-nationalist state flags, these historic battle standards do present a fascinating, complex mosaic. I'm just going to flick through a few so you can just have get a feeling of what it was all about and what they represented, because they were hugely, in fact, there was no one single flag of the Sikh Empire, particularly when the Sikh Empire's military went into battle with the British and whoever else. A huge, diverse array of flags were flown. And I'm going to give you a taste of a few of them and explain them. Of course, alongside traditional Nihang Sikh banners, flown by the Akali Nihang cavalry units, the military standards of the Lahore Darbar featured all sorts of rich, varied iconography. And here is at least one of those examples. It also included this one. This is the sun symbol. Several prominent captured flags that were captured by the British. And many of these apparently held in a museum, the Kapani collection. They do feature this prominent central sun, this golden sun motif. It's called the Suraj, and it symbolises martial radiance and cosmic authority. So again, you'll see a lot of those on some of these flags. And then we come to this one. This is the one that I saw that was supposed to be the flag. In fact, it's not. And there's an interesting story behind this one, because other regimental flags, alongside those ones I've shown you, utilised by specific Hindu and Dogra divisions, depicted allegorical figures of warrior strength. And these included characters like Durga, Chandi or Kumari, riding martial mounts into battle. Now, these symbols were chosen specifically for their historical associations with victory over tyranny. Of course, there is that Sikhi principle, that Sikhi tenet. It's always fighting the oppressed, fighting tyranny. Interestingly, though, this flag, though, you will notice, this is not a Sikh symbolism. It's actually Hindu, which then has allowed Hindutva mischief makers to sort of wade in on this. And one Indian source, I'll read you what an Indian source says about this, and then I will talk about it. The Indian source says it is a documented 19th century standard from the Sikh Empire. It features Ashtabhuja Chandi, which is Durga, Hanuman and Bhairava. Multiple historical images and eyewitness accounts confirm similar deity-adorned unit flags used by regiments. Maharaja Ranjit Singh's forces included Hindu and Sikh units with diverse symbols. Guru Gobind Singh's Chandi Devar explicitly invokes the goddess from Markandeya Purana for Bir Ras, warrior spirit, showing long-standing Sikh engagement with these motifs. Claims denying this heritage often stem from Khalistan separatist narratives seeking to erase shared Punjabi cultural roots, but primary sources and the empire's secular administration under Ranjit Singh demonstrate integration rather than strict separation. Now, that's interesting, because the argument there is, it's these Khalistanis are trying to sort of rewrite history. Actually, no. Khalistanis, and myself amongst them, are saying, no, the fact that many of these standards included Hindu deities and Hindu characters is actually symbolic of the fact that the Sikh empire was diverse. In fact, Sikhs were a minority. And that is the whole point. And I'll talk about this philosophically in a moment. But ultimately, whilst Hindutva might sort of say, oh, well, it's you Khalistanis lying and rewriting history, the whole point of these flags is it proves the whole concept of Khalistani egalitarianism. Everybody is treated equal. Hindus are equally welcome and are fully integrated. They are treated as equals. That is the symbolism of this flag that flew for the Sikh Empire. So, anyway, but I'll talk about that in a moment more. I just want to show a few more flags before I do talk about that. Interestingly, and I haven't done a piece on this, and hopefully one day I will, there was, interestingly, a huge amount of Western influence in the Sikh Empire, particularly the French. The elite Fauj-e-Khas, if I pronounce that correctly, that is the modern French trained infantry division, was of the Sikh Empire, of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's military. It was actually commanded by European officers, French officers, like a guy called General Jean-François Allard, marched under a tricolour battle standard, which is actually obviously modelled directly on the French flag. And the one up above is sort of follows, roughly the same sort of colour schemes. But that is an original, that picture down below in the Middlestone Museum here in the UK. Again, I mean, what a fabulous piece of history. So this rich diversity was no accident. It really was a deliberate reflection of that sovereign empire, the Sikh Empire, that was confident in its core values, confident in its military strength, and what was called its pluralistic governance. In other words, it wasn't a Sikh theocracy. In other words, it wasn't just Sikhs only. It was open and welcome to all faiths. And that really is the important element of this whole discussion. Because understanding those historical flags, those banners, those war standards, and here's the great man himself, actually. So I'm just pausing for a moment to admire. It's such a great picture, that. But these, so looking at those flags, these battle standards, it provides a crucial lesson for us today, because the Sarkar-i-Khalsa, the Sikh Empire, was never a narrow ethno-religious autocracy. It wasn't that Sikh theocracy. Now, the ideological foundation, yes, was firmly rooted in those egalitarian values of Gurbani and the sovereignty of the Khalsa Panth. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh himself created a secular, multi-faith state where merit superseded religious or even caste background. In other words, it didn't matter what your faith was, you would be promoted or used in the administration or governance depending on how good you were for the job, not because you happened to be a Sikh or a Hindu or whatever your caste was. So it's fascinating. And here, this is the Lahore Darbar, the capital at the time. In the Lahore Darbar, Muslims served as prime minister, as foreign ministers and artillery commanders. Hindus managed finance and led elite cavalry regiments. And even European generals, French generals, built modern artillery divisions. And Sikhs led the strategic defence of that whole northwestern frontier. So again, we talk about integration. Unlike European powers back then of the 19th century, or even the hyper-centralised majoritarian state structures that exist today, that is India, that is Pakistan, etc. Ranjit Singh's governance of that empire was marked by religious tolerance, it was marked by local autonomy, and of course an absolute prohibition on capital punishment. But of course, this contrast is absolutely essential when we evaluate what we are promoting, this whole concept of Khalistan and Sikh self-determination today. Now, modern state propaganda, obviously generally emanating from India, from Hindutva, always tries to mischaracterise the demand for Khalistan as some sort of narrow fundamentalist or exclusive project. It's, it's some sort of narrow extremist Sikh, bunch of Sikhs, trying to impose, extreme Sikhi on people. It is absolutely not. That is the Hindutva narrative. And, as indeed discussed earlier when we talked about the flags, But of course, when you look at that historical precedent, as we often do, that wonderful empire led by Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji, that Khalsa blueprint for statehood is fundamentally pluralistic. It is justice orientated. It is protective of minority rights. It represents a system where sovereignty, Patshahi, is utilised not to crush the rights of others, read India, but instead to establish a just, fear-free social order, what was called the Halemi Raj. So, it does bring us right up to date. The strategic role of these unifying symbols in our modern day 21st century fight for Khalistan. This, interestingly, is one of the original Khalistan flags. And just as a sidebar on this one, I'm just going to just quickly mention this. Khalistan FA, what is their strip going to be, their football strip? I've seen it. I can't show you it yet because it's hidden, it's secret. But I've seen it. Thank you to the guys at Khalistan FA. They have given me a sneak preview. It is a fabulous bit of kit. And as a bit of a hint, of course, well, unsurprisingly, it's going to be associated with the Khalistan flag. But ultimately, I didn't even realise this. I thought the Khalistan flag actually was the bright yellow one. But this, with the dark blue as well, I'm sure most of you guys were aware of this. I wasn't. This is, again, part of my educational journey. But this is, one of the original flags of Khalistan. So ultimately, whether it was the 19th century or modern-day Balochistan, all these sovereign movements, or of course even the global Sikh diaspora, these flags are so deeply, deeply important. They are the national symbols that serve a purpose far beyond just their aesthetics, what they look like. They are these visual anchors of collective identity, of continuity, and most importantly, resistance against assimilation by larger countries. A flag really is an assertion that a nation exists. It possesses a memory. It claims its right to exist on the international stage. And of course, they are the most deeply motivating things. In any liberation struggle, they serve as a common rallying point. I said soldiers, men and women have literally spilled their blood holding on to flags like this. They are a rallying point that transcend regional, economic, generational divides. They just communicate a shared destiny amongst us all. So when I talk about the significance of these things, the battle standards of Lahore, Darbar, of the Sikh Empire itself, they all served a purpose all the way through to today. So I talk about continuity. The flags of the original Sikh Empire live today in today's iterations of those things. So anyway, for me, that was a bit of an indulgence. I'm always fascinated by militaria, but flags, as I say, they hold so much deep resonance. Certainly if you've ever served in an army, how important the symbolism, that's the word I'm looking for, that a flag carries is enormous. Right, anyway, I'm going to move on now to New Zealand. Hi guys, I know we've got some watchers, some observers, some audience in New Zealand. Nice to see you guys again. I'm going to talk about New Zealand. This is quite an interesting development a few days ago. I did pick up on this actually, because it's slightly counter to what's going on, I would say, in the Northern Hemisphere with some Western nations that I will talk about in a moment. And we do talk a lot about New Delhi, India's foreign operations, their transnational oppression. And that activity, those naughty operations, are now starting to trigger, finally, a bit of a wave of economic, political and intelligence pushback from at least some Western capitals. I say some because London clearly hasn't woken up to this, but anyway. And as we know, for years, Indian foreign policy has operated under the assumption that Western democracies would just simply turn a blind eye to what was going on in India, to that domestic authoritarianism and extrajudicial foreign covert operations going on Canadian soil, British soil, American soil, all really in exchange for trade deals, because they were dangling that great massive carrot of that huge market of 1.4 billion people. And of course, the interesting economic market for defence partnerships, for arms sales. And ultimately, of course, the geopolitical strategic benefit of India being aligned against China. So, in other words, India's got away with it so far because they've just assumed that the West are more interested in profits than human rights. But not in every case, as it turns out. Recent months, negotiations surrounding the proposed New Zealand-India free trade agreement have actually started to descend into a bit of political warfare within the New Zealand Parliament. Good heavens, is this democracy actually in action? Now, Wellington's corporate trade lobby, the Agriculture Ministry, they pushed relentlessly to try and get this free trade agreement over the line, particularly for export access for dairy, forestry and agricultural sectors. But political opposition and, of course, intelligence agencies have actually forced a bit of a dramatic backpedal. The dispute actually reached a boiling point after public disclosures revealed that political leaders were privately warned by national security officials that deep trade concessions, immigration easing, diplomatic alignment with India are actually carrying with them a lot of risk, a huge amount of risk. So there are two elements to this scrutiny on New Zealand's political establishment. Firstly, it's all about foreign interference and domestic security. So following global law enforcement sweeps, targeting Indian state-linked criminal networks across North America, Europe, that Operation Hardball that we've talked a lot about, New Zealand's intelligence service, the NZSIS, I don't know how you pronounce that, is it NZSIS or NZSIS? Anyway, New Zealand's intelligence agency. It is under huge amounts of pressure to investigate whether state-backed transnational intimidation networks are actually operating on New Zealand's soil. Big question. And secondly, we're seeing a lot of social and political friction on New Zealand soil. This debate over this free trade agreement is unfolding against an interesting backdrop, and we've touched on this quite a bit in recent times, over domestic tension within New Zealand itself. We've seen far-right anti-immigrant groups and political opportunists deliberately targeting Sikh religious processions like that Nagar Kirtan in South Auckland. Now, one of the key instigators is that guy Brian Tamaki. I've done loads of stories about that extremist Christian. Christian, he's a cult. He's an extreme right-wing cult leader, this guy Brian Tamaki. But that is symbolic of a lot of this right-wing rhetoric and tension that's creating problems in New Zealand society, and using this rhetoric of foreign interference to then stir up hate, which is now putting New Zealand's parliament in a bit of a bind. So, of course, you've got corporate interests demanding economic deals with India quickly. We want access to that massive market. But you've got civil rights advocates and minority MPs are now saying, human rights. We've got to stop the abuse of human rights. We've got to stop the foreign interference in our affairs. And, of course, foreign agency transparency clauses need to be instituted on any of these deals before any sort of trade concession is ratified. In other words, human rights first, and then we'll do trade deals. Great. I mean, I want to say it's counter to a lot of the Western nations. Yeah, I have to say it's the only nation that I can think of, certainly in the Five Eyes, that has actually raised this publicly in Parliament to any effective extent. Now, for Delhi, what was supposed to be this sort of frictionless economic victory is actually now mired in deep institutional scepticism. New Zealand, they thought New Zealand would just roll over, but they haven't. Bravo to New Zealand. Hats off. And gosh, was it a year or two ago? Hindutva, there was a Hindutva interviewed New Zealand's Prime Minister and said, when are you going to start clamping down on the Khalistani terrorists? And he pushed back and said, no, we're a democracy. We believe in free speech. Sorry, if you don't like it, tough. But this is what happens in a democracy. So again, we tip our hat to New Zealand. But of course, it's not just New Zealand. Hot and cold Canada. It has blown hot and cold, depending whether it was Trudeau or Carney. But ultimately, there is still stuff going on behind the scenes, and I'm going to report on that now. Because this economic friction is actually it's just the surface reflection of a much deeper structural rift that is genuinely, clearly happening across all Five Eyes nations, despite what is appearing on the surface. And again, we talk about Carney, we blame Carney, the globalists, etc. But there's still a lot going on beneath the surface that we are not party to. And clearly in Ottawa, there is stuff going on, despite Carney forging ahead with his relationship with Modi. And we had, of course, the expulsion of high-ranking Indian diplomats post the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. We had the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, their investigations linking Indian consular officials to Bishnoi and all the extortion rackets, etc. But Canada's diplomatic infrastructure has actually also undergone a bit of a historic purge. Really low level. This hardly hit the mainstream. I had to do a lot of digging to even uncover what's happened in recent days, because this hasn't been reported in the mainstream to any extent whatsoever. Reports are confirming, it appears, that over 24 Indian diplomatic personnel and mission staff have been kicked out of Canada. They've been quietly declared what's called persona non grata. That means you're not welcome. They've been denied visa renewals or pressured into hasty resignations and kicked out of Canada following CSIS reviews, security reviews. In other words, the Canadian intelligence has looked at these guys and said, you're not staying in Canada. So Ottawa has sent a message that is actually pretty unambiguous. Diplomatic immunity is no longer a shield to run your covert intelligence operations, to run your intimidation campaigns or your murder for hire networks against Canadian citizens on Canadian soil. So well done. Clearly, as I say, there is this constant disjoint between the RCMP and CSIS and the politicians. Read primarily Mark Carney. Mark Carney says one thing, welcomes Modi, shakes his hand, but law enforcement and clearly, the diplomatic corps are saying something else, at least behind the scenes. And then, of course, we have the US. This is, I'm chuckling. This is Gurpratap Singh Pannoon again. I mean, I always start chuckling when I talk about Gurpratap Singh Pannoon and Sikhs for Justice, because they're always there. I mean, you can always rely on Gurpratap. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Hang on a second. You can always rely on Sikhs for Justice for really rattling cages. Because, of course, they've just done this. This is page one of about 4 pages. It's a long letter addressed to the White House. Because Sikhs for Justice, and not just SFJ, it's an alliance as well, alongside Sikhs for Justice. They've filed formal submissions with federal regulatory bodies and loads of congressional committees, alleging that systematic Indian state interference in US municipal and federal political campaigns has been going on. And these filings assert that state-aligned proxy networks, in other words Hindutva, covert campaign donations, diplomatic influence operations, they've all been deployed across California, New York, Washington State to suppress, Washington, to suppress pro-Sikh voices, to influence local law enforcement, and particularly into appointments, in other words, to get more India-aligned appointments into key positions, and political figures. And we know that Operation Hardball uncovered all sorts of those mechanical links between Indian state intelligence and the criminal cartels, the Bishnois, the Bhagwan Puris, etc. But these electoral interference claims are actually now starting to get some more serious traction on Capitol Hill. So they are being taken a bit more seriously now. In other words, has US politics being influenced by Hindutva? Well, we know the answer to that because I talk about it regularly. I provide the evidence regularly. But it does appear that the US administration is now starting to take a bit more serious attention to this. So I just want to quickly just talk about, I've looked at the clock, we've only got 15 minutes left. I've still got loads to do, so I'm going to rush through this as best I can. I just want to quickly examine this sort of hypocrisy that does lie at the heart of this situation between Five Eyes and India. And it's a reality that every serious national security analyst understands, but few politicians, particularly corporate politicians, dare speak out loud. There is, of course, this systemic tension pulling Western capitals apart. It is the conflict between professional intelligence agencies and the political leadership, which I've obviously just been talking about. Ultimately, what this boils down to is the law enforcement and intelligence agencies know. They know the truth. They know whether it's FBI, CSIS, RCMP, MI5, ASIO in Australia, NZ, SIS New Zealand. They know what's been going on. They've got the evidence. They know New Delhi has repeatedly breached international human rights laws. They know that Indian state intelligence has weaponised incarcerated gangsters, the Bishnoi gang, money networks, covert hit squads. They know they are behind the extrajudicial killings, the harassment, the intimidation, etc. And that is frustrating because then, of course, you've got the politicians and the corporate interests who are constraining them because political leaders and globalist trade architects remain obsessed with a singular profit-driven agenda, integrating India as the ultimate economic counterweight to China. And of course, very conveniently, a massive market for Western capital. So that is the constant battle that we're facing and we're fighting. Anyway, right, as I say, I've got to quickly move on. A quick one this, back to Punjab. Punjab politics. Recent weeks, a significant shift has actually taken place within Punjab's administrative and political circles. I've talked a lot about Punjabi politics, but this guy, KBS Sidhu, he's a civil servant. He's a veteran bureaucrat. He's served at the highest levels in Punjab's state machinery. He's called for an independent Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Punjab. And his proposal marks a huge admission from within the Indian state. So, of course, we've had decades of extrajudicial killings, mass disappearances, the cremations, etc. There's been no justice. Of course, justice has been delayed and justice denied. But now calling for a formal commission to document human rights violations, to catalogue custodial deaths, to hold state institutions accountable, this is huge. So people like Sidhu are now starting to acknowledge what civil rights groups have argued for decades. You cannot have regional stability in Punjab without this sort of accountability. You cannot have historical amnesia. You cannot have justice denied. So if India actually starts to hold itself up to the mirror and be accountable, then you might even start to see stability in that region. So, and then talking of which, Waris Punjab Day. I want to quickly talk about Waris Punjab Day because as I say, I do follow these guys because I still think these guys hold the key to the future of Punjab and potentially Khalistan. Because Punjab's active political landscape still remains defined by, obviously, its history. And Waris Punjab Day, of course, won a massive landslide democratic mandate in those last elections. We had Abhira Amritpal Singh, he's the head of Waris Punjab Day. He still remains incarcerated under the NSA, the National Security Act, over in Assam, Dibrugarh jail. But the state apparatus is still trying to prevent his release. They're using all sorts of dirty tricks, basically to stop him taking the floor of the Lok Sabha, as is his political right, and serving his constituents who elected him with a majority of over 200,000, or nearly 200,000. But instead, far from crushing his political movement, the state repression has actually, it's had the opposite effect. It has solidified Waris Punjab Day's electoral influence. Of course, we've got Punjab elections coming up next year. And Waris Punjab Day are now positioning themselves, I'm happy to say, to hopefully play a big part in those elections. Because there's all sorts of strategic electoral moves on the way. The fielding candidates and building grassroots coalitions right across Punjab around drug rehabilitation, civil liberties, of course, and, of course, riparian rights, the rights of access to their own water. And the movement doing this is demonstrating that the demand for Sikh self-determination cannot be erased, even if you imprison Amritpal Singh. The irony, of course, the irony, we've got Lawrence Bishnoi enacting the Indian state's illegal extrajudicial killings from his jail cell, while Amritpal Singh is enacting democracy across Punjab from his jail cell. Obviously, he's not been given mobile phones or whatever to do it, but anyway. So, good luck to Waris Punjab Day. And then finally, I'm just going to quickly move on to the final story. As I say, we're only out of time now. I definitely wanted to cover this today. I love this story. This is the wonderful story of a UK law graduate. I don't know the lady's name, It is in the video. It's somebody or other Kaur, obviously. She's a Sikh, as we say here in the UK. But this was her graduating. And I've got the video, and I'm going to play it for you now. So, her name is announced. She takes to the stage. This is a very typical graduation ceremony. Receives her graduating certificate. And there it is, the Khalistan flag. Bless you. Well done, you. Her quick 5 seconds still manages to get the Khalistan flag on display. What a wonderful thing to see. This is the young. We talk about continuity, and I always talk about ensuring that the next generation are educated, not indoctrinated, but educated with the history, their culture, their heritage, of course, the painful trauma that their own families were subjected to in past generations, particularly in Punjab. But it is great as the Khalistan movement moves forward. It is not a movement of old people, or not even of middle-aged people. It is also a movement that is, in a very positive way, engulfing the young. So bless you, well done to this lady. And actually, this isn't the first time this has happened. When I was looking at this story and trying to actually find this video, I came across one I did actually share before. I love this one too. This is in Canada, likewise, a similar graduation ceremony. And I think I did show this actually at the time. There you go, another one. Well done you, sir. Fabulous. So it's great to see the Khalistan flag taking centre stage with these students. So well done to you guys. It's wonderful to see. As always, carry that flag with pride. Get it out at every opportunity. So let's wrap up today's show with some comments. And where are we? Here we are. Yeah, let's go. Punjab. Welcome back, Punjab. Yes, me again, indeed, Punjab. It's always a pleasure to see you, whether on the live show or indeed in the comments on today's show. A white Christian murders Anne Widdecombe. Will we see a headline like this? Never. Rest in peace, Anne Widdecombe. For those of you wondering what this is about, a terrible story. One of our right-wing politicians, a lady called Anne Widdecombe, she was 78 years old. Very high-profile lady, very outspoken, very opinionated, but a politician, a normal, decent lady, actually, by all accounts, a very nice lady. She was murdered in her own home a few days ago. And there's been a whole weird situation about it. It's very hard to get the truth because the police have deliberately not released information, particularly when the murder happened, because it was clear it was a political crime. It was a hate crime perpetuated by somebody on the left wing, a left-wing extremist. But the whole thing was covered up. They said it was a burglary gone wrong. In reality, this guy drove, allegedly, 270 miles from his home in the north of England down to where she lived, killed her, then got in his car and drove back. And they said, no, it was a burglary gone wrong. Now, you do the maths, as they say. Clearly it was a political crime. And the police have covered it up. But this also, it ties into your comment, Punjab. The police and our governments are forever, and our media are forever covering things up. It's always hard to get, even here in our democracy, where supposedly we have a free press. In reality, we don't totally. Because all the stories around this murder of Anne Widdecombe have been all covered and framed with a political agenda. And actually now it's turning out that the person who murdered her might well have been from an ethnic minority. But we don't know for sure. Because the court reporter, we don't have photography in our courts. So they had to draw a picture. But the picture this person, the journalist, drew, we have professional portrait painters, whatever you call it, in court, because they can't take photos, drew somebody that looked like of Arab or Asian descent. And yet the picture released by the police was somebody clearly of white descent, which immediately then raises the questions, hang on, what is the truth here? And as you refer to, you're referring it to obviously from a different angle, Punjab, and I totally understand your angle. But the reason I've said all what I've said is because we don't know. You and I are still really in the dark about what happened because somebody in our government is keeping the truth from us. That is not right in a democracy, in a land supposedly that is free, that has a free press. But also there is an agenda at play, and that is what you're referring to. There is an agenda at play, not just with our media, but with our government. And you can look at this agenda and interpret it from hundreds of different angles. You've interpreted it from one way, I've interpreted it from another, and everybody else is interpreting it from different ways. In other words, we don't know the truth because they are hiding the truth from us. It's very sinister. So thank you, Punjab, for pointing that out again. Softy Muffins is back. Hello, Softy Muffins. Thank you. You were always there in the comments. It's always nice to receive your comments. With the red ice cream cones, I'm still not entirely sure. Are those popper things of celebrations? Anyway, it's lovely to see. It's just nice to see you there. Nice to know you're there. SSC Tim. True journalism. Well, I do my best, but thank you for your support. I hope it is the truth. I do my best to bring you the truth. And a simple expression of love, which, of course, as always, I turn straight back to you guys with a huge amount of appreciation for all your support. Gimon Growell, one of our regular Satsri Akals. Thank you. Thanks, Angus. Great. Well, big thumbs up to you, Satsri Akal. Thank you for your continued loyalty. It is very much appreciated. Stay safe. Always there in our comments. This is referring to, we talked about this yesterday, a great extent. Indian police are pretty brutal, aren't they? I mean, certainly the British police couldn't get away with what the Indian police get away with. These lathi charges, these wooden sticks, which are really ruthlessly brutal. They waded in with tear gases, the lathi charge against the CJP. They brooked no mercy whatsoever. Demonstrators gathered basically I think you're updating with me. Thank you for the information, and as you saw from yesterday's show, I have actually got an updated situation. But as you say, at the moment it's not quite as large as the farmers' protests of 2020 and 2021. And as I say, refer to yesterday's show to get a full breakdown. There were 3 protests, and it's frustrating, I have to say, from our mischievous outside perspective that they haven't actually joined forces and coordinated. Because if all these huge protests united, that is the greatest fear that Delhi has, that the BJP have. That there is some sort of coordinated, organised uprising, particularly across Punjab. But once it starts bringing in other regions, as in fact the university protest last year did, that's why they suddenly gave in, because they realised when you start to draw in support from all the rest of India, then they know India is about to topple. The government will go. That is literally that fine line that they're treading. So yeah, they were different protests. And as I say, it's slightly frustrating. They were all protesting about different things. Had they all united, who knows where that could have led? It's always, as I say, it's always these catalytic events. It needs to reach that threshold of momentum, that tipping point. And so far, it's always reached a tipping point, but just been brought back, whether through government action or whatever, or just natural action. But it just takes once to go beyond that tipping point. The momentum then becomes too full for the government to stop it. And then suddenly, that's when governments topple. India breaks up, etc., etc. So it's back again. Government intervention can improve safety through regulations. But too much, you see, this is the argument about between socialism, communism and capitalism, between the freedom, let market forces determine things, or complete state control, which is right, which is wrong. I'm a huge believer in market forces. The market always finds the most efficient equilibrium. It's just, to me, it's just basic common sense and science. But there are those from a socialist angle who says no, because of human weaknesses, there will always be unfairness, imbalances. There will always be the rich who exploit and the poor who suffer. Therefore, you need state interference to try and redress that balance, which, again, is a noble cause. But sadly, it never works because of human weakness. So, but as you say, yeah, it's Sikh businesses. Sikhs, some of the greatest entrepreneurs, particularly in the West, they are a vital part, as you say, of not just the American economy, of all our economies out here in the West. So if you start to interfere regulatorily in Sikh entrepreneurship, then you're damaging, basically, the English phrase is, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. So if you target Sikhs with regulation, all you're doing, apart from hurting Sikh livelihoods, is you're hurting your own nation. So in other words, lay off. Angus Bro, hello Avatar Singh. He's hidden by security services because other IPS butchers, there isn't any justice for Sikhs. Yes, indeed. This is just a reminder about justice delayed, justice denied. Will these butchers ever see justice? Has that guy who has vanished been hidden, protected? Yes, of course he has. We all know he has. We knew when he was early released that he would very conveniently disappear, and we know he'll probably be protected. And then the discussion about, well, how many died? These people say that the Hindus argue 25,000 Hindus were murdered, etc., etc. But yeah, is it true? We don't know. And in fact, I did say I was going to do a piece on this. Maybe next week, if I get time, I'll do a piece. I said I would actually do an analytic piece with lots of research, hopefully, on what are the genuine numbers of those who died that we know about, at least. But this is why we need truth commissions. This is why Bhai Jaswant Singh Kalra's widow has pressured the Occult Act, fortunately, it was agreed, into a new documented repository of evidence to find out the truth. Because we need to know how many died. And Jaskirat Singh, Vaiguruji, Chadi Kala, Khalistan, Zindabad. Perfect timing. That's the hour. On the hour mark. How about that? It's not very often we manage to stay in time. But as if by divine magic, indeed, Vaiguruji maybe has ensured we've finished bang on time with the right message. Khalistan, Zindabad. We are all in Chadi Kala because we know good things are coming. We know Khalistan is on its way. But we're still on that road. We are still putting one step in front of the other, and it still requires us all to make those efforts, to get out there, get the flag flying, attend all these protests, attend all the events. We've got the Indianapolis referendum coming up soon. I'll talk about that maybe next week. That's what must be in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So, but yeah, it's all about getting out there, getting people to know what Khalistan is and what it represents. But that is it for another day. Thanks so much for watching. Do keep your comments coming in. I need your comments, obviously, to talk about at the end of the show. Otherwise, we'll have nothing to talk about. And I always enjoy our comments section. So do keep your comments coming. Of anything interesting you think I should know about or talk about, send me a message at satlodgetv.com. I do read every email. Thank you for all of you who have emailed. Much appreciated. But that is it for another day. Thanks so much for watching. Podcast tomorrow, Dr. Greywell. We'll have a fascinating discussion. Do watch that tomorrow. Apart from that, have a great rest of the week, great weekend. I will catch you guys, all being well, live again on Monday. That's it for another day. Have a great weekend.